My next guest chairs the powerful Senate Intelligence Committee and says there are serious national security concerns at stake, and he's vowing to push this bill through to President Biden's desk. Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner joins me now. Great to have you with us, Senator. So the CEO of TikTok was on Capitol Hill today lobbying senators to block the bill. He said the vote is an outright ban on an app that half of all Americans use. You're in favor of this bill. You say it's important we pass it. Why?
Well, TikTok is very popular. I'm first to acknowledge that, and I absolutely believe that it shouldn't go away. It just shouldn't be controlled at the end of the day by the Chinese Communist Party. And regardless of what the CEO says, Chinese law dictates as of 2017 that every company's first obligation in China, and ByteDance is a Chinese company, is not to shareholders, not to customers, but it is to the Communist Party. And as Steve Mnuchin said, you know, China does not even allow Facebook or Google. The idea that China would allow a major media company owned by Americans into their country is beyond the pale. And the two reasons this is national security: 170 million Americans, all of that data that is being collected ultimately could be used for nefarious purposes. We've seen the Chinese spy services try to blackmail people in the past. The idea that this data is going to potentially reside in Beijing ought to scare the dickens out of everybody. And the second half, the genius of TikTok is it kind of knows what you like before you know.
Right.
And for a lot of young people, they get their news off of TikTok.
It's the number one. It's the number one source of news.
If you don't think the Chinese government, as this election year goes on, might try to twist that news and say, you know what, Taiwan really ought to be included in China, or Vladimir Putin ought to have Ukraine because, you know, authoritarian governments band together. We would never allow that kind of propaganda tool. I mean, it's like the idea that China would come in and buy Fox News or MSNBC. We'd never allow that. Why do we allow 170 million Americans to have that kind of, given that kind of control to the Communist Party?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, listen, it's the number one app in the country. It started as a place to see cute dance videos, and it morphed into, as you just pointed out, the number one news site for young Americans, young adults in America, whose stories are fed by an algorithm designed by this Chinese-owned company, ByteDance. Do you believe China is already using that algorithm to spread disinformation?
I think there are reasons why the Energy and Commerce Committee, after it got a security briefing, voted 50-0 to advance this bill. I think there is both the potential and actual national security issues that exist that are enormous. And in a world where earlier this week we had in front of the Intelligence Committee, you know, what's called the worldwide threats hearing.
Yep.
And we talked about Putin in Ukraine, we talked about Iran, but we also talked about the fact that America is still spending millions of taxpayer dollars ripping out Huawei, another Chinese telecom company's equipment, because its ability to spy, that we've got competition in terms of Chinese companies with drones, with also national security issues. Why would we let this, again, very popular app that's sucking up information about Americans and then potentially being a propaganda tool? You know, I don't want it to go away. I just like it to be owned by somebody other than the Chinese. It doesn't have to be Americans. It could be Brits. It could be Brazilians. It could be French.
Yeah.
But it ought to be somebody that is not an authoritarian regime.
And by the way, the Five Eyes, you know, including our CIA Director Chris Wray, have been warning now for months loudly that the Chinese are stealing and sabotaging in the corporate, you know, intellectual space. Why on earth, if they're stealing all this sort of data and IP, intellectual property, why wouldn't they be stealing our personal data? And then we had this week them sending out push notifications to millions of its users, urging them to call their congressman and vote no. TikTok connected those users to their congressman. These people, many of them didn't know who their congressman was, but TikTok did.
Well, you're right. And actually, Elizabeth, they had to solicit everybody's individual zip code information. And frankly, their over-the-top lobbying actually backfired in their face. And, you know, most Americans, if they don't follow everything on Capitol Hill, but I can tell you, to get 352 members to vote for anything, and you had the current speaker and the former speaker both voting for this, you had people on the left and the right. Now, you had the far left and the far right, as would always.
Yeah.
They were not for it. But the vast majority of members on both parties is an overwhelming, because that number dictates the fact that we need to take this up in the Senate, and I believe pass it. If we have to amend it, if we have to give it a little more time for a sale to take place, those are all things. But at the end of the day, this is a risk that we shouldn't continue to allow to exist.
Senate Majority Leader Schumer has not yet scheduled a vote on this. When might that happen?
Well, I would give Schumer a little bit of a break there. The bill only passed yesterday, so it's moving fairly quickly. I've had conversations. The Commerce Committee chair, Maria Cantwell, had a bill that was slightly different. I had a bill a year ago that was broadly bipartisan that would have taken a different approach. I think a preferred approach, but this is not the time for the perfect to be the enemy of the good.
All right.
If this bill through the House gets us to the goal of getting this Chinese ownership replaced by American or somebody else, and people can still have the videos and still do the social influencing, that would be a good result.
And if it can't, if they won't sell it, you're prepared to ban it, even though half of Americans use it.
I think I would say this. If the Chinese Communist Party is not willing to give up this asset and refuses to sell, that in itself ought to be a shot across the bow about the benignness of this company.
Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.